The winter Sadie Morgan almost lost everything began with a sound she would never forget. A thin, rasping cough that rose from the back bedroom of her small cabin, just as the first real snow of 1878 began to fall across the Colorado high country. She was 31 years old, a widow of 2 years, and alone in the way that the frontier made people alone, not just without company, but without margin, without cushion, without the comfortable certainty that tomorrow would look anything like today. Her husband, James Morgan, had been taken by a runaway team of horses on the eastern edge of their property, leaving her with a deed to 80 acres of Rocky Mountain land, a milk cow named Bess, a smokehouse with a modest supply of cured pork, and 3 children who needed feeding whether the world cooperated or not. Her oldest was Thomas, who was 9 years old and already trying to carry himself like a man, which broke Sadie's heart in the particular quiet way that such things break a mother's heart. Then there was Clara, who was 7 and had her father's dark eyes and the habit of watching everything from corners, as if the world were a thing better observed than entered. And the youngest was little Will, who had just turned 5 in October and still sometimes reached for his father in the mornings before remembering, and the remembering would pass across his small face like a shadow over still water. Sadie kept the farm going through sheer stubbornness and a practical knowledge of hard work that her own mother had pressed into her since before she could read. She planted in spring, preserved in summer, laid in stores for winter as best she could. She traded eggs and butter at the general store in Harwick, which was the nearest town, 4 miles down the mountain road, and she stretched every resource the way frontier women learned to stretch things thin as paper, but without tearing. The cough she heard that November evening was coming from Clara. She set down the pot she was carrying and went to the back room, where all 3 children slept in 2 beds pushed together. Clara was sitting upright, her face flushed even in the dim light of the oil lamp, her dark eyes bright with a heat that had nothing to do with the fireplace. Sadie pressed her palm to the girl's forehead and felt the fever burning there like an ember pressed into the skin. By morning, Thomas had it too. By the second morning, Will was burning. Sadie knew about fever. Every woman on the frontier knew about fever. She knew it could run through children like fire through dry grass, and she knew that the winter of 1878 was already being called hard by the men at Harwick, who had seen enough Colorado winters to have an opinion worth listening to. The mountain road to town was already deep in snow, and the sky above the cabin was the color of pewter pressing down. She had willow bark in her supply box, and she made tea with it and coaxed it into 3 small mouths and sat through the first night watching the rise and fall of 3 small chests. She was not a woman who cried easily, but in the long dark of that first night she allowed herself one quiet cry, bent over the wash basin in the kitchen, before she wiped her face and went back to her children. She did not know then about Timothy Barlow. He was 35 years old, and he had lived on the mountain for going on 8 years, in a cabin he had built himself from timber he had felled himself, set back in a bowl of land above a creek that ran cold even in August. He was what people in that part of Colorado called a mountain man, though he preferred no particular title. He had come west from Ohio after the war, where he had served 2 years in the Union Army, and come back changed in the way that the war changed men, not broken exactly, but rearranged, with certain pieces of himself stored somewhere he could not always locate. The mountains had suited him. They were honest about their harshness, which he had found more bearable than the dishonesty of softer places. He trapped in winter, traded pelts at Harwick in spring, kept a kitchen garden in summer, and hunted in fall with a patience and precision that had made him one of the better hunters in the county. He was not a sociable man by preference, but he was not unfriendly. Those are different things, and in the mountain country they are understood to be different. He knew the names of the families in the area, knew their circumstances in the practical way that neighbors on the frontier knew each other, because knowing might mean the difference between someone living and dying when a storm came through. He had known James Morgan, not well, but enough to respect him. And he had seen Sadie Morgan twice, once at the Harwick General Store in the summer of 1877, when she had been loading supplies into a wagon with the focused efficiency of a woman who wasted no motions, and once at the church social that the Methodist congregation held in September of that same year. She had been standing at the edge of the gathering with her 3 children around her like planets in close orbit, and she had laughed at something the preacher's wife said, a real laugh, surprised out of her, throwing her head back slightly, and Timothy had looked away fast, as if he had seen something too private for his eyes. He knew she was struggling. People on the mountain knew each other's struggles the way they knew the weather, not through gossip exactly, but through observation, through the slow accumulation of small signs. He had noticed that the Morgan woodpile had shrunk faster than it should have by the second week of November. He had noticed that the milk cow was looking thin. He had noticed, on his one trip through that part of the trail in late October, that the fence along the eastern pasture had a section down that a man with 2 strong arms would have had up in an afternoon. But he was not her family. He was not her neighbor in the close sense. He was a man who lived alone on a mountain and was careful about the boundaries between his life and other people's lives, because those boundaries were the architecture of a kind of peace he had built around himself after the war. Then came the night of November the 14th. He had been out checking his trap line along the lower creek when he came around the bend in the trail that gave a view down the slope to the Morgan cabin. The light in the window was wrong. It was the middle of the night, perhaps 2 in the morning, and the light was not the bank timber glow of a house at rest. It was the moving light of a lamp being carried, back and forth, the way a lamp moves when someone is walking from room to room with purpose and with fear. He stood in the snow and watched for a long moment, and something shifted in him, some internal mechanism that had been set a long time ago that he could not have named but that he obeyed. He was at her door in 10 minutes. He knocked, and there was a pause, the pause of a woman alone in the night at a door, and then a voice. "Who is there?" "Timothy Barlow," he said. "From up the creek. I saw your light. I'm not here with trouble." Another pause, and then the door opened. She was standing in the doorway with the lamp held up, and the light caught the exhaustion on her face, the deep, bone-set exhaustion of someone who had not slept properly in days, the strain around her eyes and mouth that fear writes on a face and that does not easily wash off. She was wearing a work dress and a shawl wrapped tight, and her dark hair was loose, pulled back only roughly, and she was looking at him with the directness of a woman who had no time for anything but directness. "The children," she said. "They have fever, all 3. How long?" 3 days on Clara, 2 on Thomas. "Will started yesterday." He nodded once. "Is it going down?" "No," she said. And in that single word he heard everything she was not saying. He was inside before she finished saying it. He was not the kind of man who made scenes of his helpfulness. He moved into the cabin the way he moved through the woods, with economy and purpose and no wasted motion. He put more wood on the fire without being asked. He assessed the supply situation in the kitchen in about 45 seconds and said nothing about what he assessed. He went to the back room and looked at the 3 children with the careful eyes of a man who had field-dressed wounds and managed worse situations than fever, though he said nothing about that either. "Willow bark tea," he said. "I have been giving it," she said, "every few hours." He nodded. "You have elderberry, some. And yarrow," she hesitated. "I had some last spring. I am not sure. I have yarrow," he said. "I have elderberry too, more than I need. And I have dried venison broth that would help with the littlest one if he is not keeping things down." She looked at him. The lamplight was steady now, and in it she could see him clearly, a tall man, broad across the shoulders in the way of someone who had used his body hard for years, with dark hair threaded with some gray at the temples and a beard that was close-trimmed, and eyes the color of creek water in shadow, gray-green and very direct. There was nothing soft about his face, but it was not a hard face either. It was a face that had been tested and had chosen, somewhere in that testing, a particular kind of quietness. "You do not have to do this," she said, not because she wanted him to leave, but because she needed him to know that she understood the weight of what he was offering. "I know I do not," he said simply, and somehow the simplicity of it made it more rather than less. He went back up the mountain for his medicinals and returned within an hour, moving through the snow at a pace that said he was not concerned about the cold or the hour or the exertion. He brought yarrow and elderberry and a jar of broth he had clearly prepared in advance, still faintly warm from being carried against his body. He also brought, without comment, a side of smoked venison that he set by the back door. Over the course of that night and the following day, Timothy Barlow did not leave. He was not a hovering presence. He was not in the way. He positioned himself as a useful thing, which is different, making broth, keeping the fire, spelling Sadie and the watching of the children, so she could sleep in 2- and 3-hour intervals that she would not have allowed herself otherwise. When Will became delirious in the early hours of the second morning and began crying for his father, Timothy sat beside the child's bed and talked to him in a low voice about things he could see from his own porch on a clear day. The way the aspens looked in the first light, the sound the creek made when it ran under ice, until the boy quieted and drifted back down into sleep. Sadie had come to the doorway to check and had stood there unseen, listening to that low voice, and had felt something move through her chest that she did not examine closely because this was not the time. The fever broke in Clara first on the third day. Then Thomas, that same evening. Will held on longest, his small body fighting longest, his temperature climbing again in the middle of the fourth night, until Sadie was on her knees beside his bed with both of Timothy's hands gripping hers, while she prayed in a low, fierce voice that was not prayer so much as negotiation, not asking so much as demanding, in the particular tone that a mother uses when she is making a case to the universe on behalf of her child. The fever broke in Will just before dawn, the fifth day. She sat on the floor beside his bed and did not cry. She had cried that first night. She had been through her tears, and what was left was a kind of enormous, still gratitude that did not know what to do with itself, that just sat in her chest like a quiet, enormous thing. Timothy was in the kitchen. She could hear the stove. She got up and went to the kitchen doorway, and he was standing at the stove making coffee, his back to her, and she said, "Will's fever broke." He turned. The expression that moved across his face was not one she had expected, not relief exactly, but something more immediate than that, something that was almost pain before it settled into something quieter. He nodded. "Good," he said. The word carried more weight than one syllable ought to carry. She sat down at the kitchen table, which was what her legs were telling her to do, and he put coffee in front of her and sat across from her, and they did not speak for a while. The morning light was coming through the one east-facing window, clean and white off the snow outside, and the cabin was warm, and from the back room came the soft, regular breathing of 3 sleeping children. "I do not know how to thank you," she said at last. "No thanks are required," he said, which she already knew was going to be his position, and which was correct and also, she suspected, incomplete as a full accounting of the situation. "You have been here 5 days," she said. "You have your own traps. Your own cabin. Nothing that could not wait," he said. She looked at him across the table. "Timothy Barlow," she said, "I know who you are. I know you are a man who does not insert himself into other people's affairs without reason." Something about the way she used his full name, "She would do this, he would learn," when she was making a point, seemed to land on him in a particular way. He met her eyes and then looked at his coffee cup. "The children needed help," he said. "You needed help. That is reason enough." "All right," she said, because she could see he was not going to say more on this particular topic at this particular moment, and she was too tired for the conversation that lived underneath this one. He stayed 2 more days. He fixed the section of fence on the eastern pasture that had been down since October. He split 3 days' worth of wood that he stacked by the back door. He checked on the milk cow Bess and gave Sadie his honest opinion that the cow was going to need better feed if she was going to keep her production through the rest of the winter, and offered, without elaborating, to bring some down from his own supply. When he finally left, late on the 7th day, he paused in the doorway with his coat on and his pack on his back and looked at her standing in the lamplight, and something passed between them that was not words and did not need to be, but that Sadie noticed in the way she noticed things quietly, and filed it in a place where she was careful with things she could not yet name. "You can send Thomas up if you need anything," he said. "He is old enough to make that walk." "Thomas is 9, she said. "He is not walking up the mountain in winter." A very small movement at the corner of his mouth. "All right, then you can send a smoke signal." She blinked, and then she laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, the same laugh he had seen at the church social 18 months ago, and he was out the door before she finished laughing, and she stood in the doorway watching him walk up the trail into the dark until the snow swallowed him. December came in cold and settled. The Morgan children recovered fully. Clara was the first to be completely herself again, back to her corner watching and her careful observations. Thomas moved through his returned health with the solemnity of someone who had been frightened and was not going to say so. Will bounced back with the extraordinary resilience of 5-year-olds, who seem to store energy in some reserve that only illness can deplete, and that refills completely once the illness is done. Sadie got through December by managing very carefully. She was not a woman who indulged in worry that was not actionable, and she directed her energies toward the things she could do something about: the cow, the woodpile, the supply of dried beans and cornmeal, and the salt pork that was going to need to last until March at the minimum. She made her calculations with a cold eye and did not let herself look at the column of figures too long in the evenings, because she knew the figures were tight and looking at them longer did not make them less tight. Timothy came down from his place twice in December. The first time was to bring the cow feed he had offered, a substantial portion of oat hay that he carried on his back in multiple trips, which she watched from the window with a feeling that was gratitude, and something else underneath the gratitude, something she pushed back down before it had a chance to become a named thing. The second time was the week before Christmas, when he appeared at her door with a wrapped parcel that contained, of all things, a pound of hard candy, peppermint and horehound, and a set of small carved wooden animals. He had made the animals himself. She could tell by the way he set them on the table and looked at them rather than at her, the slight tension in his jaw that might have been embarrassment, which she found extraordinarily touching in a man of his particular composure. "They are for the children," he said. "I gathered as much," she said. "Will you come in?" He came in. He sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and talked to the children, which was a different Timothy Barlow than the silent, efficient one who had managed their illness. With the children he was unexpectedly good, not in a performed way, but in a genuine way, the way of a man who had perhaps not had enough of children in his life, and was surprised to find that he liked them. He let Will tell him a very long and largely incoherent story about something that had happened with the cat, and he listened with full attention, his elbow on the table and his chin in his hand, nodding at appropriate intervals. He helped Clara with a puzzle she had gotten out, and when she deliberately gave him wrong information about which piece went where, a test, Sadie recognized, because Clara tested everyone. He accepted the wrong information, tried it, found it didn't work, and said mildly, "I wonder if you might have that one switched," without any edge in his voice, and Clara's careful watching face softened a fraction. Thomas, the oldest and most complex, watched from the other side of the room for a long time before he came, and sat near enough to be included. Sadie stood in the kitchen doorway and watched all of this and felt the unnamed thing pushing harder against the wall she had put around it, and she went back to the stove and focused very hard on making supper. She invited him to stay and eat. He stayed and ate. They talked about ordinary things, the state of the mountain, the prospects for the spring trapping season, the situation at Harwick where the new sawmill had been causing disputes about water rights, the rumor that the Denver and Rio Grande was going to extend its line another 30 miles into the territory. Ordinary things. But the ordinary things had weight in them, the weight of two people who were paying attention to each other in a particular way and both choosing not to acknowledge it yet. He left before dark. He always left before dark. He was a man who kept his own counsel and his own distances, and she respected that because she recognized it. She kept her own counsel too and her own distances, and had reasons for both. January was harder than December. A stretch of days came in the middle of the month when the temperature dropped to places that made the mountain genuinely dangerous, when the cold was not merely uncomfortable but had the quality of a serious adversary. The children stayed inside. The cow stayed in the small barn. The woodpile shrank at a rate that Sadie measured each morning with the part of her that never stopped calculating, never stopped assessing the margin. One afternoon in the third week of January, Thomas came to her where she was mending by the fire and said, in the careful voice he used when he was telling her something he thought she might not want to hear, "Mama, I went to the smokehouse." She looked up. "The pork is almost gone," he said. "I just wanted you to know." She held his gaze and made her face do the thing she needed it to do, which was not show him the cold recognition that moved through her at his words. "Thank you, Thomas," she said. "You did right to tell me." She went to the smokehouse herself that evening and saw what she had already known in the back of her accounting mind, that the supply of cured pork was down to perhaps 3 weeks if she was careful, and careful did not begin to cover the stretch that would be needed to bridge the gap to spring. The salt pork was the bulk of their protein. The venison Timothy had brought was long since eaten. She had dried beans and cornmeal, which would sustain life but not 3 growing children through the hardest part of winter. She went back inside and sat with the figures for a long time that night after the children were asleep. She could send Thomas to Harwick. The road was passable in daylight if the weather held. She could put the last of her egg money toward the store, and she could ask Hector Marsh, who ran the general store, about credit. Hector Marsh was not a bad man, but he ran a business, and he had his own family to consider, or she could go herself. But leaving 3 children alone in the cabin in January was not something she was willing to consider. She had not much else she could trade. The cow's production was down to barely enough for the children. She had a quilt she had been working on. She could finish it in a week, and quilts were worth something at the store. She had 2 of James's tools she had been holding on to, a good draw knife and a surveyor's level, that she might get a fair price for. She went to bed having made a plan, which was the only way she knew how to go to bed when the circumstances were what they were. She did not know what Timothy Barlow was doing that same night. He was at Harwick. He had come down from the mountain 2 days earlier with the season's first substantial load of Pelt's beaver, marten, a few fox, and had stopped at Jonah's Whitfield's trading post to conduct his business. The trading was fair. Timothy was known as a reliable trapper who brought good quality pelts, and Jonah's Whitfield was, within the standards of his profession, a reasonable man. After his trading, he did not go back up the mountain. He stood in the cold outside Whitfield's post and looked at the money in his hand, which was good money, the best he had seen from a first winter load in several years. He had been planning to put most of it toward a new rifle and toward a substantial increase in his own spring supply of flour, cornmeal, coffee, and salted goods, because his own winter stores were running lower than usual. He had given Sadie more of them than he had initially calculated, and the gap was becoming noticeable. He stood there a while. The January cold was pressing down on the town of Harwick, and the street was nearly empty, and a small wind moved a tin sign over the livery with a sound like a slow bell. He thought about 3 small faces in a back bedroom of a mountain cabin, and a woman at a kitchen table calculating figures with a steadiness that he had recognized as the kind of steadiness that cost something. He went to Hector Marsh's general store. What he did there was not a complicated transaction. It was, in fact, quite straightforward. He used the money from his pelt trading to purchase provisions: smoked venison, salt pork, 50 pounds of cornmeal, 20 pounds of flour, dried beans, oats for the cow, a can of molasses and a tin of coffee. And he arranged with Hector Marsh, in specific terms that Hector Marsh understood and would remember, that these provisions were to be delivered to the Morgan place on the old logging road, attributed to a general community fund that Hector Marsh was to say had been collected from several sources in recognition of a widow's difficulty, and that under no circumstances was the name Timothy Barlow to be associated with the delivery. Hector Marsh looked at him for a moment with the particular look of a man who is assessing the character of another man and finding the assessment more favorable than expected. "That is a generous thing," Marsh said. "It is a necessary thing," Timothy said. "Do we have an understanding about how it is to be presented?" "We do," Marsh said. "Good." Timothy left Harwick with considerably less money than he had arrived with. He had enough remaining to cover the barest basics of his own supply: flour and coffee and salt, the essentials that could not be improvised, but the new rifle he had been wanting for 2 seasons would have to wait, and his own stores for the remainder of the winter would be lean in ways that would require careful management. He walked back up the mountain in the fading afternoon light and did not think about this in terms of sacrifice, because that was not how his mind worked. He thought about it in terms of a problem that had existed and a solution that had been applied, and that was, to him, sufficient. The delivery arrived at the Morgan cabin 3 days later, brought by Marsh's hired man, Abe Tyson, with a note in Hector Marsh's handwriting that said there was a community fund for families in need, and that the Morgan family had been thought of. Sadie stood in the doorway and watched Abe Tyson carry the provisions into her kitchen, and she felt relief that was so profound it made her legs want to give out, and she held onto the doorframe and did not let them. She read the note twice. She thought about asking Abe who had contributed, but he was already turning his horse and heading back down the road, and the wind was picking up, and she had provisions to store. She fed her children a proper supper for the first time in a week: salt pork and cornbread and beans, and she sat at the table after they were asleep and held the note in her hands and felt the relief and the gratitude, and underneath both of them, something that did not quite fit the explanation she had been given, a texture to the situation that she could not quite smooth flat. But winter on the frontier does not give a woman time to chase uncomfortable questions. She stored the supplies. She managed her wood. She kept the children warm and fed. She finished the quilt she had been working on. She wrote in her small notebook the way she always did on Sunday evenings, keeping her account of the weeks. February blew in with an enormous storm that lasted 4 days and left the mountain buried in a snow that was spectacular and beautiful and deeply inconvenient. Sadie dug out the door herself on the morning of the 2nd day. Thomas helped. They dug a path to the barn for Bess, and Sadie found she was laughing at one point, because the snow was up to Thomas's chest in places, and he was absolutely refusing to acknowledge any difficulty with this situation, moving through it with his jaw set in a way that was so purely his father's expression that it made her heart seize, and then, strangely, warm, because it meant James was still here, in the set of his son's jaw, and that was not nothing. Timothy appeared on the 5th day after the storm. He was not the sort of man who sent word ahead. He appeared at the door with snow in his beard and his pack on his back, and he asked if everyone was well, and she said yes, and he said good, and she said she was about to make coffee, and he came in. He had brought more yarrow in case, he said, without elaboration, and a leg of a deer he had taken just that morning, which was fresh enough that she could start something with it that night. They sat at the kitchen table, and the children moved around the cabin in their various ways, and Timothy and Sadie talked with the ease of 2 people who had already been through something together and did not need to build up to conversation from the ground, who already had a shared vocabulary of small things: the way the creek sounded under ice, the behavior of the milk cow, Thomas's stubborn jaw, Will's inexhaustible appetite for stories. "The storm missed you?" she asked. "Hit me fully," he said. "I spent 2 days not going anywhere." "What do you do for 2 days in your cabin?" He thought about this. "Carve, read, think about things that need doing in spring." "What are you reading?" He told her. It was a collection of natural history essays he had gotten from a traveling bookseller the previous fall, and he described the content with a precision and an evident pleasure that told her this was a man who thought carefully about what he read. She told him she had been reading, too, a novel she had gotten from a woman in Harwick, an old book, but she had not read it before. She described the story, and he listened with the same full attention he gave the children, and then he said something about it that was unexpectedly sharp, a genuine observation that made her sit up slightly, made her see the book differently, and she said so, and something shifted in the atmosphere of the kitchen in a way they both noticed. This happened more and more as the weeks went on. He would come down from the mountain every week or 10 days, always with some pretext, a brought thing, a fixed thing, a thing he had been passing this way to attend to, and the time he spent at the Morgan cabin grew, incrementally, from a cup of coffee to a meal, to an afternoon of conversation that stretched into the early evening before he recollected himself and took his leave. The children were involved in his visits in a way that happened without anyone planning it. Will had adopted him with the uncomplicated directness of a 5-year-old, and would station himself beside Timothy at every available opportunity, and provide detailed narration of whatever he was doing. Clara had passed through the testing phase and arrived at something that might, very cautiously, be called fondness, though she would not have permitted the word. She simply began sitting closer when he was there, and once, when a particularly complex problem in her small reader stumped her, she took it to Timothy rather than to her mother, and he spent 20 minutes on the floor with her working through it. And when she understood it, her face broke into a smile of such pure satisfaction that Timothy caught Sadie's eye over the child's head, and the look they exchanged was not something either of them forgot. Thomas was the most complex case. He was at the age when the loss of a father was a particular wound, because he was old enough to understand the magnitude of the absence and young enough to still need what had been absent. He watched Timothy with the wariness of someone protecting territory whose value he understood very well, and Timothy did not push, did not perform, did not try. He simply continued to be what he was, which was reliable and unhurried, and eventually Thomas began making small overtures that a less observant person might have missed sitting a little closer, asking a specific question about trapping or about timber or about the way certain things worked in the world of men. And Timothy answered each question seriously and fully, as if it were the most important question he had been asked that day, which, Sadie suspected, he genuinely believed it was. She watched all of this from her various positions, the kitchen doorway, the other side of the table, the front porch where she sometimes stood in the evenings when the weather allowed, and she let the unnamed thing become a named thing, quietly, privately, inside the accounting she kept of herself. She was falling in love with Timothy Barlow. She was not afraid of this exactly. She was cautious with it, the way she was cautious with anything that mattered, the way she was cautious with the children, with the land, with the careful balance of resources that kept her family alive. She was a practical woman, and she applied her practicality even here, to this thing that was not practical at all. And what she concluded was that it was a real thing, not born of gratitude or loneliness or the distorted perspective of a hard winter, but a real and accurate recognition of a particular man. She was also not certain that he felt it in return, because he was not the kind of man who declared himself easily, and because she was very careful not to mistake courtesy for something more. But February became March, and March began its slow thaw, and the signs that spring was coming brought with them a lightness to the world that was physical, the light changing, the quality of the air shifting, the first brave green pushing up through the snow at the south-facing edge of the yard. And Timothy came down from the mountain on a Tuesday in the second week of March with a particular look about him that she had not seen before, a kind of restlessness just below his usual composure, and she thought, "Something has changed." He had coffee and talked about the spring thaw and about his plans for the trapping season, and then he went quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. And Sadie, who had learned the calibrations of his silences the way you learn the calibrations of a particular landscape, let the quiet sit for a moment and then said, "Something is on your mind." He looked at her. "Something has been on your mind for several visits," she said. He looked at his hands. "You are observant," he said. "I am observant," she agreed. He was quiet for another moment, and then he said, "I would like to say something to you, and I want to say it plainly, because I think you deserve plain speaking." "All right," she said. "I think about you," he said. "I think about you, and I think about the children, and I think about this place. And when I am up at my cabin, I think about coming down here. And when I am here, I think about when I am going to be here next. And I am aware that this may not be, that you may not." He stopped. He was, she realized, actually struggling with this, which was so unlike the Timothy Barlow she had come to know that it made her chest ache with something that was tenderness and more. "Timothy Barlow," she said. He looked up. "I think about you too," she said. The look that crossed his face was something she would hold in her memory for the rest of her life. The relief in it, and the surprise in it, and underneath both, something that had been there for a long time being finally allowed to stand in the light. "I should also say," he said after a moment, "that I am aware of the circumstances, that you are a widow with 3 children, and that I am the kind of man I am, and that there is no obligation—" "Stop," she said, not unkindly. "I know what your circumstances are. I know what my circumstances are. I am not a woman who needs to be managed from uncomfortable facts. I have been managing them for 2 years. "I know," he said. "I know that. Then speak to me as you would speak to someone who knows her own mind." He met her eyes, and something in the directness of her gaze seemed to unlock something in him, and he said, "Then I would ask if I might court you, properly, with your knowledge and your permission. I would like to come down here not as a neighbor paying calls, but as a man who is declaring an intention." Sadie sat with this for a moment, not because she did not know her answer, but because she wanted to be present for the moment of it, wanted to mark it properly. "Yes," she said, "you may." The weeks that followed were some of the best weeks of her life, and she thought about this sometimes with a kind of wondering appreciation, that in the middle of a hard 2 years, in the middle of the frontier with its particular demands and its unrelenting economy of difficulty, she was experiencing something that had a warmth and a sweetness to it that she had not expected to feel again. Timothy came down from his mountain more often. He was still himself, still quiet, still economical with words, still the man who fixed the fence before he said good morning. But there was something unfurled about him now that had not been unfurled before. He brought her wildflowers that were just starting up through the snow at the edge of the timber, pressed them into her hand without ceremony. He made a point of walking with her in the evenings when she went to check on Bess in the yard, and in those walks they talked, really talked, deeply and at length, about things that mattered. She learned about the war. Not the details of it, not the battles, but the shape of what it had done to him. The way he had come back from it and not been able to find himself in any of the places he had left himself before, and how the mountains had been the first place that felt like it fit the changed man he had become. He told her this simply, without drama, as a fact about his life, and she listened with the same full attention he gave everything she said. And she told him about her own history, about growing up in Missouri, about coming west with James when she was 23, about the early years on the mountain that had been so hard and so beautiful in equal measure, and about the 2 years since James had died, which she did not minimize and did not inflate. Just described with the honest accounting she applied to everything. "You are the most capable person I have ever met," he said one evening. They were standing at the fence line, the last of the March light going gold over the mountains, and the air had that particular quality it gets in early spring when the cold is still present but retreating, when the world is in the last stage of its holding on before it lets go. "I am not," she said, with a short laugh. "You are," he said, without the inflection of a compliment, just a statement of observation. "You have kept 3 children alive and a farm running in the kind of circumstances that would have flattened most people. That is not sentiment, that is just what I have seen." She looked at him. "You helped," she said. "Some," he said. "More than some," she said. And she meant the fever week and the wood and the cow feed and the visits with their quiet steadiness. She did not yet mean the provisions from Harwick, because she did not yet know about the provisions from Harwick. That was still ahead of her. Spring, in the Colorado high country, does not arrive with any gentleness. It arrives in argument, snow and thaw and mud and cold, and then the sudden startling warmth of an April day that makes you believe it is all over, followed by 3 more days of snow that remind you that the mountain sets its own terms. But by mid-April the thaw was genuine. The creek ran loud with snowmelt. The aspens were starting their yellow-green. The mud in the yard was the particular productive mud of new season, and Bess was producing well again, and the kitchen garden's first tentative planting was possible. It was on an April afternoon, with the air warm enough that the children were outside and the cabin doors were open for the first time since autumn, that Sadie went to Harwick. She had Thomas with her, mounted on the old bay horse, and she went to Hector Marsh's general store for the first real restocking trip of spring. She had her egg money and the price she had gotten for the quilt she had finished in January, and she felt the particular lightness of a frontier woman in early spring who has come through the winter and is back on the right side of the ledger. She exchanged greetings with Hector Marsh, who was a florid, decent man who had known James Morgan and was generally kind to her without being condescending about it, which was a distinction she appreciated. She made her purchases. And then, as she was settling the account, she said, because she had been meaning to say it for months, "I never properly thanked you for organizing that community fund in January. The provisions made a real difference to us. I have wanted to express my gratitude." Hector Marsh looked at her. A complicated expression moved across his face, the expression of a man who has been placed in a position he did not anticipate and is calculating very quickly. He opened his mouth and closed it again. "Mrs. Morgan," he said carefully, "I am glad it helped." Something in his tone, something in the way he had looked at her, not evasively exactly, but with a kind of caution. "Who contributed?" she asked. "I should like to thank them properly. I assumed it was several people, but I would like to know who." Another pause, just a fraction too long. "It was a single contribution," Marsh said, and then stopped, as if he had said one word more than he intended. She looked at him. "I gave my word about the details," Marsh said. He met her eyes, and she could see that he meant what he said, that he had given his word and intended to keep it, and that the giving of that word was also telling her something if she was willing to read it. She stood very still at the counter. She thought about January. She thought about the specific contents of that delivery: venison, salt pork, oat hay for the cow, cornmeal, flour. She thought about who in the county had those specific provisions in those specific quantities and would know precisely what her household needed in those precise amounts. She thought about who had been at her cabin 5 days before Christmas and had looked at her smokehouse and her cow and her woodpile with the same assessing, comprehensive attention he gave everything. "Hector," she said. Her voice was remarkably steady. "The community fund. Was it Timothy Barlow?" Hector Marsh looked at the counter. He looked at her. He looked at the counter again. "Mrs. Morgan," he said very carefully, "I gave my word." She understood that to be his answer. She stood at that counter for a moment that stretched strangely, the way moments do when something large is happening inside them. She heard Thomas outside talking to the horse. She heard the ordinary sounds of the April street beyond the door. She heard the blood in her own ears. Timothy Barlow had used his winter pelt trading to provision her family. He had paid for it. He had arranged for it to be anonymous. He had arranged for the explanation that would allow her to accept it without feeling the particular kind of pride wound that she would have felt if she had known it was him. Because he knew her well enough, even then, to know that she would have felt that wound, would have received it harder than a gift. He had thought of all of that. He had thought of her pride as well as her need, and he had arranged things accordingly, and then he had continued coming down from the mountain with his firewood and his medicinals and his quiet company, and he had said not one word. Sadie Morgan could not speak, not because she had nothing to say. Because there was too much to say, and it had arrived all at once, and language, which she normally commanded with considerable confidence, was not equal to the task of containing it. She stood at Hector Marsh's counter with one hand resting flat on the worn wood, and she was silent for a full 2 minutes, and Hector Marsh had the wisdom and the kindness to let her be silent. What she was feeling was not simple. It was love. She already knew she loved Timothy Barlow, had known it for weeks, but it was something beyond that, something that love does not quite have a word for. That is the particular feeling of realizing that someone has seen you fully and responded to what they saw with a generosity so careful it brought tears to her eyes standing in the general store in Harwich in April 1878 with her son outside on a horse. She was not a crying woman. She blinked. She breathed. She thanked Hector Marsh for his time and gathered her goods and went outside into the clean spring air. Thomas looked at her from the horse. "Mama, are you all right?" "I am perfectly all right," she said, and she was. She was better than all right. She was in possession of a knowledge that had reorganized her understanding of the winter she had just survived, that had placed Timothy Barlow at the center of it in a way she had not known before, and she was driving home through the first real warmth of April with her heart so full it pressed against her ribs. She needed to talk to him. But she also needed to be very careful about how she approached this, because she was about to break the anonymity that he had very deliberately maintained, and she needed to think about what she said and how she said it and what it meant that he had done this and not told her. She spent the drive home thinking about it, which is to say she spent the drive home knowing, at every level of herself, that what Timothy had done was not the act of a neighbor, or even a man who was courting a woman in the ordinary sense. What he had done was the act of a man who had already, quietly and without announcement, decided that her children's safety was his concern, that her well-being was his business, that the wall between his life and her life was not actually a wall at all. She sent Thomas to Timothy's cabin the next morning with a note that said simply, "I need to speak with you. Please come down at your earliest convenience. Sadie Morgan." Timothy was at her door by mid-afternoon. He came in with his usual composure and accepted the coffee she offered and sat at the kitchen table, and she sat across from him, and the children were outside in the spring afternoon and the cabin was quiet. She looked at him for a moment. He met her eyes with an expression that was steady but held something watchful in it, as if some part of him already knew what was coming. She said, "I went to Harwich yesterday." "All right," he said. "I thanked Hector Marsh for the community fund provisions," she said. "In January." A small, almost imperceptible stillness came over him. "He was very careful," she said. "He kept your confidence. I want you to know that. He told me nothing directly, but I am not a woman who misses things, and I had already been adding things up for a while." He said nothing. He was looking at her with that Creekwater gray-green gaze that she now knew contained a great deal more than it revealed. "Timothy," she said, and then, because language was still not entirely adequate and she had promised herself she would not make it smaller than it was, "you traded your winter store, your pelt trading, your supplies." "Some of it," he said, which was, she suspected, a significant understatement. "Why did you not tell me?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because you would not have let me do it if I had told you." "That is probably true," she said, and because he stopped. He looked at his hands, which she had noticed he did when he was working out something that was harder to say than he wanted it to be. Then he looked back at her. "Because it was not something I did to put you in my debt. I did not want it to be that. I did not want it to sit between us as a thing you owed me. I wanted you to be helped and I wanted it to be simple." She looked at him for a long time. "Do you understand what you are telling me?" she said very quietly. He held her gaze. "I think so," he said. "You are telling me that you were already in love with me in January," she said. "That you were already acting as though what happened to my children was what happened to you." The word love hung in the air of the cabin like something physical, solid, and present, and she watched it land on him, and what she saw in his face was not retreat but recognition, the look of a man who has been told a true thing and is meeting it honestly. "Yes," he said. His voice was low and steady. "That is what I am telling you." She stood up from the table. He watched her uncertain, and she came around the table and she stood in front of him, and she took his face in both her hands, his rough, winter-weathered, extraordinary face, and she looked at him at very close range, and she said, "You are the most careful, most stubborn, most quietly decent man I have ever encountered, and I love you, Timothy Barlow, and if you ever do something like this again without telling me, I am going to be furious with you." The corner of his mouth moved. "Define furious," he said. "Outstandingly angry," she said. "Noted," he said, and his hands came up and covered hers where they rested on his face, and the warmth of his hands was steady and real and present and there, and she felt the world settle into a configuration that was new and right in the way that things are right when they have stopped pretending to be something other than what they are. He kissed her. It was not an uncertain kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had made up his mind a long time ago and was finally, with her full and explicit permission, acting accordingly, and it was warm and deliberate and careful and absolutely certain all at once. And when it ended, she had her hands in his hair and his arms were around her, and the spring light was coming through the east window with the particular clean quality of April light in the mountains. And outside, she could hear 3 children laughing about something she couldn't see. He told her the full account of it then. She had asked for plain speaking, and he gave it. He told her about standing outside Jonas Whitfield's trading post in January with the pelt money in his hand, and the calculation he had made, and what he had given Hector Marsh, and what it had taken from his own winter supply. He was matter-of-fact about it. "This is what I did, and this is why," in the straightforward language of a man reporting a decision he stands behind. She listened without interrupting. She held his hand across the table, because she had reached for it and he had let her keep it, and she listened to the full account of the night he had stood in the January cold of Harwick and chosen her children over his own comfort, and she was as close to speechless again as she had been at Hector Marsh's counter, but this time not from shock, from the opposite of shock, from the deep-settled certainty of knowing a person's character fully and finding it better than anything she had asked for. "Your winter was harder because of what you gave us," she said. "Some," he said again. "Timothy." "All right," he said. "Some harder than I would have liked." She squeezed his hand. "You should have told me. Not at the time. I understand why not at the time, but at some point." "I was afraid," he said. "Simple as that." "Of what?" "Of what it would mean," he said. "If I told you, it became a thing between us. A thing I had done that had weight, and I did not know then if there was something between us to bear that weight or if it would just be a burden you felt." She looked at him. "You thought I might not want you," she said. "You had not given me any particular reason to think otherwise," he said, not accusatory, just honest. At that point, she thought about that. He was right. She had been as guarded as he had those first months. She had not declared herself in any way. The unnamed thing had been unnamed on both sides. "Well," she said, "we have found each other now." "We have," he said. The spring moved forward with the energy that spring always brings after a hard winter, a particular urgency to it, the sense of the world making up for lost time. Sadie planted her kitchen garden. She and Timothy together repaired the fence on the south pasture that had also taken damage from the winter storms. He began building an extension on the cabin. She had not asked him to, but she had mentioned once that the back room was tight with 3 children, and she came out one morning to find him with a measuring line, walking the perimeter of the cabin with the focused expression of a man who has already decided where the extension will go. She stood in the doorway watching him for a moment. "You could ask first," she said. "Would you say no?" he asked without looking up from his measuring line. She considered. "No," she said. "Then there is not much point in asking," he said, and she laughed. He moved his trapping operations down from the upper mountain, partially, establishing a secondary line that ran through the lower country closer to the Morgan place. He was not at the cabin every day. He was still the man he was, still valued the solitude of his own place, still needed the mountain and its particular quality, but the distance between his world and hers had compressed in a way that felt natural and right. One evening in late April, the children were in bed and Timothy and Sadie were sitting on the front porch in the cool evening air, and the stars were out in the high country way that makes you feel the sky is very close and you are very small, and neither of these things is frightening, and he said, "I would like to ask you something." "Ask," she said. He looked at the sky for a moment, not nervously but with the deliberateness of a man choosing his words. Then he looked at her. "I would like to marry you," he said. "I would like to be your husband and the children's. I would not presume to take James Morgan's place, but I would like to be something settled for them, and for you. If that is what you want." She looked at him, the stars above them, the smell of pine and early spring earth, the sound of the creek carrying from somewhere down the slope. "Yes," she said, "that is what I want." He exhaled, and she realized that he had been holding something for a while, and this made her reach over and take his hand, which he held the way he held everything she gave him, carefully and as if it mattered enormously. They were married in June of 1878 at the Methodist Church in Harwick, in a ceremony that was simple and attended by the small community that Sadie had built around herself in the years on the mountain. Hector Marsh and his wife, several other families from the surrounding area, the minister and his wife who had first seen them both at a church social 18 months before. The children were at the front of the church. Will, who was 5 and had no understanding of what a wedding was supposed to look like, clapped enthusiastically at several inappropriate moments, and no one minded. Clara stood very still with the intense observation she brought to everything, and at the moment when Timothy and Sadie made their promises to each other, Clara looked at Timothy with her father's dark eyes and then nodded once, very slightly, as if she had reached a decision, which in all likelihood she had. Thomas stood straight-backed and serious through the ceremony, and at the end of it, when Timothy turned from the altar, Thomas stepped forward and shook his hand with a dignity that made half the church hide smiles, and Timothy shook his hand back with equal seriousness and said quietly, "Thank you, Thomas," and meant it in a way that Thomas, who was not a child who missed things either, understood completely. That summer was a good summer. The garden grew well. The cabin extension was finished. Timothy built it with a solidity and care that was characteristic of everything he made with his hands, and it added a proper second room to the back of the cabin that gave the children space and gave the adults something like privacy. He was not an easy man to know quickly, but he was a man who rewarded knowing, who opened up gradually like the high country in spring, slowly, with tremendous care, revealing things of such particular beauty that you could not help but feel privileged by each one. He read to the children in the evenings. This had started because Will had attached himself firmly to Timothy and demanded stories with the persistence that only 5-year-olds can truly maintain, and Timothy had produced from somewhere a small collection of books that he read from with a particular expression on his face, slightly solemn, slightly entertained, absolutely present. Clara sat nearest to him during these readings. Thomas pretended to be engaged with other things but was always, without fail, within hearing. Sadie watched from the kitchen doorway in the evenings and felt a happiness that was real and clear-eyed, not the uncomplicated happiness of a woman who does not know what she has, but the complicated happiness of a woman who knows exactly what she has and how it was arrived at and what it cost, and who holds it with both hands. She had been through a hard winter and a harder grief before it, and what was on the other side of those things was this man reading to her children in the lamplight, this extension on the cabin that smelled of fresh timber, this spring garden doing well, this sense of a life that was whole again in a different configuration than it had been before, but whole. She was not naive about the frontier. The frontier did not do guarantees, and she knew that. She had learned that the hard way, and she was not going to forget the lesson. But she had also learned that the hard way did not mean the only way, that difficulty was not the whole account, that the same country that gave you January could give you June. August brought a letter from Sadie's mother in Missouri, who had been following her daughter's circumstances with the distant anxiety of a woman who had watched her child go west and prayed about it regularly. Sadie wrote back with the news of the marriage and with a description of Timothy Barlow that ran to 3 pages, which was unlike her. She was normally brief in correspondence, but she found she had a great deal to say about him and kept thinking of more. Timothy, discovering this letter writing on the porch one afternoon and asking what it was, and being told it was a letter to her mother describing him, said with his particular understated alarm, 3 pages. She wanted to know who I married, Sadie said, not looking up from the page. 3 pages seems like a substantial answer. You are a substantial person, she said. She did look up then, and the look on his face was the same one she had first seen at the kitchen table in January, relief and surprise, and beneath them something being allowed to stand in the light. She had memorized that look. She would go on memorizing it her whole life. The fall was busy with harvest, and with the beginning of the trapping season, and with all the particular work of a frontier household going into winter. But now the going-in was different because there were 2 of them doing the accounting, 2 of them making the calculations, 2 people whose resources and knowledge and labor could be combined into something more substantial than either had alone. Timothy knew the mountain and its hunting and its timber and its trapping in ways she had not known to know. She knew the domestic economy of the frontier, the preserving, the managing, the particular genius of a woman who has learned to make things last, and to make something from things that others might not see the value in, with a depth that he respected completely. They did not always agree. She was direct and so was he, and sometimes the directness resulted in arguments that were, Sadie thought, the most honest arguments she had ever had, because Timothy did not back down from his position to be agreeable and neither did she, and so they genuinely worked things through rather than one of them performing agreement. After each argument she had a clearer sense of what he actually thought about things, which she valued more than smoothness. He valued the same in her. He said this once, that he had never in his life met a woman who said what she meant without ornamentation and without apology, and that he had not known until meeting her how much he needed that. Most people are afraid of it, she said. Most people, he agreed. I am not afraid of it. I know you are not, she said. It is one of the things I love about you. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was hard again. Colorado winters were what they were, but they went into it fully provisioned together, with their wood split and their smokehouse full and their children well and the cabin warm. Timothy went up to his mountain place occasionally through the winter to manage his trapping, but he came home, and it was, clearly and unequivocally, home, within a day or 2, and Sadie had learned the particular relief of a woman whose person always comes back, which was not something she had been certain she would feel again. The children adapted to the changed household in the ways of children, which is to say they adapted incompletely and nonlinearly, and in ways that sometimes surprised everyone including themselves. Will adapted fastest and most completely, because Will was 5 and the world was still being assembled for him and Timothy was simply part of how it was assembled. Clara adapted with the solemnity of someone who takes decisions seriously and means to stick by them, and she had decided in the church in June with her single small nod that this was acceptable, and she was honoring that decision. And there was an evening in November when she called him Papa, not looking at him, just said it in the middle of a sentence about something else entirely, and then kept talking as if she had not said it, and Sadie, who had been at the stove, turned away very carefully so that her face was not visible to anyone in the room, Thomas was the longest. This was expected and right. Thomas was 9 going on 10, and his father had been the fullness of his world until the day he wasn't, and no amount of liking a man made that simple. But something shifted for Thomas in January of 1879, when a fox got into the chicken coop at 3 in the morning, and Thomas woke first and came running into the main room to find Timothy already up and reaching for his coat, because Timothy had also heard the hens, and the two of them went out together into the cold January night and dealt with the fox, standing in the moonlight afterward with the henhouse secured, their breath visible in the cold. And Thomas said something that Sadie would only hear about later. "My father used to say that you can tell a man by what he does at 3 in the morning." And Timothy had considered this seriously, as he considered everything seriously, and said, "Your father sounds like he was a wise man." "He was," Thomas said. "Good," Timothy said. "Then I will try to be worth what he taught you." Thomas had not said Papa, not then, not for a long time. But after that night in January, some particular wariness departed from his face when he looked at Timothy, and what was left was something that would, in its own time, become something close to the thing they were both being careful not to name too soon. Spring of 1879 arrived in the creek and in the aspens and in the mud, and with it came something Sadie had suspected since February and confirmed with the certainty of a woman who had been through this particular process 3 times before. She told Timothy on an evening in April. They were at the kitchen table with coffee, which was where they had most of their important conversations, and she said, simply and directly, because she had promised herself she would not make it smaller than it was, "I am carrying a child." Timothy looked at her across the table, and the expression on his face was the fullness of something she would carry inside herself the rest of her life. A joy that he did not manage or contain or understate, that came across his face like light comes into a dark room, completely and all at once. He stood up from the table and came around it, and he put his arms around her and held on, not saying anything for a long time, just held her in the kitchen in the April evening with the children asleep down the hall and the creek running outside and the mountains doing what they always did, which was stand. "Are you well?" he said finally into her hair. "I am very well," she said. "I am excellent, in fact," he laughed. It was a good laugh, a full one, and she felt it through the whole of him where she was pressed against him, and she thought, "This is how joy sounds in a man who does not spend it lightly." "A baby," he said, as if testing the word. "A baby," she confirmed. He pulled back enough to look at her face. "Are you happy?" he asked, and the asking of it, the care in it, wanting to be certain it was what she wanted, not assuming, was so wholly him that she loved him more sharply in that moment than she had the moment before, which was already more than she could easily account for. "I am extraordinarily happy," she said. "Are you?" "Yes," he said, quietly, with the entire weight of himself behind it. "Yes, Sadie, I am." They told the children at supper the next evening. Will receive the news with immediate and comprehensive enthusiasm, and a string of questions so rapid that no one had a chance to answer any of them before the next arrived. Clara asked 2 precise questions and then sat back and looked thoughtful. Thomas was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Will it have your hair or Mama's?" Which made Sadie laugh, and the tension of the announcing broke into the ordinary current of an evening. The baby was born in November of 1879. A boy, which surprised some people but not Sadie, who had simply known since about month 5. They named him Samuel James Barlow Samuel for no particular historical reason, except that Timothy had always liked the name, and James for the man who had been there first and who deserved not to be forgotten in the new configuration of their life. Samuel James Barlow came into the world in the same cabin where his 3 older siblings had nearly left the world the previous winter, which Sadie thought about for a long time, that particular symmetry, the winter that had nearly taken and the subsequent year that had given, the same cold rooms made different now, full of a different kind of living. Timothy, who had been practical and present through the whole business of the birth with the same quality he brought to everything difficult, held his son for the first time with an expression that was entirely beyond his capacity to manage or conceal. He sat in the chair by the fireplace with this small creature in his arms, and he looked at him with a kind of wondering focus that Sadie, exhausted and warm in the bed and watching him, would later describe in her notebook as the look of a man discovering a country he had not known was there. "Hello, Samuel," he said, very quietly, as if introducing himself. Will appeared at the bedside with the urgency of a child who has been told he is not in the way while clearly being in the way. "Does he have hair?" Will demanded. "He has hair," Timothy confirmed. "Can I hold him?" "When you are sitting down and very still," Sadie said. Will sat down with such immediate and complete stillness that everyone in the room laughed except Will, who was too focused on the matter at hand. Samuel James Barlow turned out to be a calm, interested baby who observed the world with Clara's dark, watchful eyes and Timothy's fundamental steadiness, a combination that Sadie found extraordinary and which the children found, in varying degrees, fascinating. Will was his most devoted attendant. Clara treated him with the careful seriousness of someone who has been given a significant responsibility and intends to discharge it properly. Thomas, who was 11 now and conducting himself with a dignity appropriate to his station, was nonetheless found on multiple occasions sitting on the floor of the back room making faces at the baby to produce the baby's response, which was a wide, full, gum-bearing smile of such enthusiasm that Thomas could not help returning it. Timothy and Thomas's relationship found its full shape that winter. It was partly Samuel, the shared fascination with the baby, which was a common language between them. It was partly a conversation they had in January, around the first anniversary of the January night when they had dealt with the fox together. They were out cutting wood, the two of them, working in the easy rhythm of people who have done physical work together enough to find a shared cadence, and Thomas said, not looking up from the work, "I call him Papa in my head sometimes." Timothy stopped splitting and looked at the boy. "I do not know if that is all right," Thomas said. "My father, I still think about my father. I do not want it to mean I am forgetting him." Timothy was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Your father is not someone you could forget. He is in the way you carry yourself and the way you look when you are thinking hard and the way you stood up straight in that church last June and shook my hand. He is in everything you are. Calling me something does not take anything away from him. There is room for more than one kind of love. I believe that to be true." Thomas looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded in the same single, decisive way his sister had nodded in the church in June. "All right," he said. He called him Papa for the first time aloud that same evening, in the middle of asking him something about trapping, without announcement or ceremony, and Timothy answered the question without making any note of what had been said around it, which was exactly the right response, and Thomas, satisfied, went back to his question. Sadie, from the kitchen doorway, had witnessed this as she witnessed so many things quietly, and with a fullness in her chest that she had stopped trying to manage or contain because it would have been dishonest to do so, and she was not a dishonest woman. The spring of 1880 was warm and early. The aspens greened in March, which was unusual, and which the older men in Harwick said meant a good summer, and they were right. Timothy's trapping had been excellent that winter, partly because his knowledge of the upper mountain country was matchless, and partly because he and Thomas had begun working sections of the trap line together, Thomas learning the work with his father's concentrated attention to detail, storing knowledge the way he stored everything, permanently, carefully for use. In the summer of 1880, 2 years after their marriage, Timothy took Sadie on horseback to the upper mountain for the first time. She had never been up that high, not to his original cabin, not to the country he had lived in alone for 8 years. He brought her up on a clear July morning, just the two of them, with the children left in the reliable company of Martha Finch, a neighbor woman from the lower road who had become a friend to Sadie and who the children loved. The ride took 2 hours and climbed steeply, through timber and then above it, into the open high country where the sky pressed down enormous and clear, and the world fell away in every direction in a way that made the chest open involuntarily. His cabin was there in its bowl of land above the creek, small, solid, built with his hands, oriented to catch the morning light, with a view that was one of the finest things Sadie had ever seen. She stood outside it for a long time looking. "This is where you were," she said. "For 8 years," he said. He was standing beside her, looking at it with her, and she understood that he was letting her see something important, not just the place, but what the place had meant, the chapter of his life it represented and what it had been. "Were you lonely?" she asked. He considered the question seriously because he always considered her questions seriously. "Sometimes," he said. "I did not always know I was. I knew it better in retrospect once I had something to compare to." She took his hand. "What were you comparing to?" He looked at her. The high country light was doing extraordinary things with the color of his eyes, gray-green as creek water, direct as always, holding everything she had come to know was held there. "A kitchen table," he said, "with coffee, and you on the other side of it." She looked at him for a moment, and then she leaned into him, her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her. And they stood there in the July morning at the top of the mountain above everything they had come from, the winter of the fever, the January of the provisions, the spring when everything had become what it was, and below them, somewhere down in the trees, was their cabin with its extension, and its kitchen garden and its 3 children with a 4th in progress. Because she had told him 2 weeks ago, and they had not told the others yet, another small life on the way, another of these particular people they were making together. "We should go down," she said eventually. "We should," he said, but neither of them moved for another while, just stood in the light, because some moments are worth the staying in. They did go down eventually, and the summer went on with its abundance and its work, and Sadie found herself in the particular state of a woman who is very busy and very well, which is the best of states, which is full of small exhaustions and large satisfactions, and the daily particular joys of a life that has been built by hand, and is therefore recognizable as your own. She thought sometimes, in the evenings when the children were asleep, and she and Timothy sat at their kitchen table with their coffee, about the winter of 1878, about the sound of Clara's cough in the dark, about the 5 days of fear with the fever running through 3 small bodies, about Timothy appearing at the door at 2 in the morning because he had seen a light in the window, about the January cold of Harwick and a man standing outside a trading post with his pelt money in his hand, making a calculation that had nothing to do with himself. She had told him, one evening in the fall of 1879, what Hector Marsh's counter had been like, the specific quality of those 2 silent minutes. She had tried to find words for it and found, as she had that day, that the words were not quite sufficient, and said so. "I stood there at his counter," she said, "and I could not speak, and I am not a woman who is often without words." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What were you feeling?" She thought about it. "Like something enormous had been given to me without asking," she said. "Not the provisions, those mattered, but the thought behind them, the care. Knowing that you knew what I needed before I had to tell you, and that you just gave it without requiring anything, without making it a debt. I did not know how to hold that." "You are holding it," he said. "I am," she said. "I have been holding it since April of that year, and I intend to keep holding it." He reached across the table and took her hand, which he did whenever he felt the depth of what was between them and wanted to make it physical, to give it a location in the world. She turned her hand and held his back. The second baby, their second child together and her 4th child altogether, was born in February of 1881. A girl this time. They named her Ruth Eleanor Barlow Ruth because Sadie had always loved the name, and Eleanor for Timothy's mother, who had died when he was young, and whom he spoke about occasionally with the careful tenderness of a man honoring a specific debt to a specific person. Ruth Eleanor Barlow turned out to have her father's eyes and her mother's directness, which was a combination that promised extraordinary things. She arrived in February, and by March had established clear opinions about what she wanted and how she wanted it, which made Will, who was 7 and had been the baby of the family for 6 years, regard her with a combination of surprise and respect that he could not quite articulate. "She knows what she is about," he told Thomas, with the solemnity of someone passing along important intelligence. "All Morgan women do," Thomas said, who was 12 and observant enough to know the shape of the family he was in. "Barlow women," Will corrected. "Both," Thomas said, which was the right answer. Samuel was 16 months old and walking with great purpose and no coordination, and he regarded Ruth with the suspicious interest of one who has been the youngest and is now not. He would, in time, become her most dedicated ally, but that would take a while. The town of Harwick grew through those years. The railroad did come through, as had been rumored, and it brought with it an expansion that was not always easy: more people, more commerce, more of the complications that came with both. There was a period of conflict over the water rights at the new sawmill that involved several families in the area and required the kind of careful navigation that frontier communities required when resources were disputed. Timothy was involved in the resolution of this, in the practical way of a man who had no axe to grind and a reputation for straight dealing, and Sadie watched him work through that problem over the course of several months with the same assessment and patience he brought to everything, and felt the particular pride of knowing the specific quality of the person you have married. She also, in the spring of 1881, started a school. This had been building for years. The need for it had been obvious to anyone who was paying attention, and several families in the area had children who were getting no formal education at all. She proposed it first to the Methodist congregation, where she had enough goodwill and enough standing to be taken seriously, and then to the county, where she had to argue harder and where the argument took longer but ultimately succeeded. The school was held in a room at the back of the church 3 days a week and served 12 children initially, rising to 19 by the fall. She taught it herself. She had more than enough education for the task. She had been well schooled in Missouri and had continued reading throughout her frontier years with the purpose of someone who understood that the mind was a resource like any other and needed tending. And she had a quality with children that was different from warmth exactly, more like respect, the respect of a person who takes children seriously as intelligences and not merely as recipients of instruction. Timothy, who had not in his wildest constructions of the future imagined himself in a domestic situation involving 4 children, a school, a kitchen garden the size of some people's farms, and a wife who corresponded with the county about educational policy, found that this was, in fact, exactly where he was, and that he could not have designed a more specific version of what he had actually needed without knowing he needed it. He said this to her one evening not in those precise terms, but in his own terms, which were always more exact than more elaborate language. "I spent 8 years on a mountain thinking the solitude was what I wanted," he said. "And," she said. "And it turns out the solitude was what I needed until you," he said. She looked at him. "That is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me." "I have said other romantic things," he said mildly. "Fewer than you think," she said. "More than you give me credit for," he said. "Give me an example," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Every morning when I wake up and the light is coming through that window and I can hear the children, I think that this is the thing I would not trade for anything I have ever had or been offered. Not the mountain at its best. Not any version of my life before this. I would not trade this for any of it." She was quiet. "Was that romantic?" he asked. "Timothy Barlow," she said. "That was everything." He smiled, the real smile, the one that changed his whole face, the one she had been adding to her collection for 3 years, and she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and outside the April wind was moving through the aspens and the creek was running, and down the hall 4 children were sleeping and the world was doing what it did, which was continue, and which was enough and more than enough and exactly right. The years on the mountain moved in their particular rhythm after that seasons and work, and the particular punctuation of births and winters, and the slow growth of children who were becoming, before Sadie's eyes, the people they were always going to be. Thomas grew into a young man of extraordinary capability, and a quiet character so like his father's in some ways, and so like Timothy's in others that Sadie sometimes looked at him, and felt the completeness of what had happened to them all. The way loss and love can braid themselves together into something that is not resolution exactly, but is wholeness, a different kind of wholeness from what existed before. Clara became a person of razor precision and surprising humor, and when she was 15, she began helping Sadie with the school, and it became clear within a year that she was perhaps a more natural teacher than her mother, which Sadie acknowledged with a pride that was not competitive but entirely admiring. Will remained full of story and motion, and a fundamental sunny quality that the frontier could not entirely weather out of him, though it tried. He had Timothy's patience when it came to the outdoor work, the trapping and the hunting, and by the time he was 12 he was more useful on the trap line than many grown men, a fact Timothy acknowledged directly, and that Will received with great dignity. Samuel grew into his father's steadiness and his mother's directness, a combination that his older siblings found extremely convenient when there was a problem to be solved, and his younger sister Ruth found aggravating when she was in the wrong and he was pointing it out. Ruth Eleanor Barlow grew, as everyone around her had perhaps predicted from her February arrival, into a person of very strong opinions and the intellectual equipment to defend them. She was her mother's child in ways that made Timothy look at them side by side sometimes with a kind of wondering amusement. Sadie, in the spring of 1883, sat at her kitchen table on a Wednesday morning, the coffee in front of her, the light coming through the east window, the sound of the children moving through their morning, and wrote in her notebook, as she did every Sunday and sometimes on other days when the fullness of things required an accounting. She wrote about the school, which had grown to 23 children and was being discussed by the county as a model for other communities in the area. She wrote about Samuel's latest impossible question, which had been about why the sky was blue, and had required Timothy an entire evening to answer to the child's satisfaction. She wrote about Ruth's first attempt at baking, which had resulted in something that was not bread and was not cake, and was, somehow, both delicious and structurally improbable. And then she wrote, because she always came back to this, because the accounting was not complete without it. I have thought many times about what Hector Marsh did not say at his counter in April of 1878, and what I understood from what he did not say, and the way the world looked different when I walked out of his store. I have thought about January cold and a man choosing to stand in it for us. I have thought about what it means to be loved by a person who knows how to love quietly and practically and completely, who does not ask for anything in return except to be present to the thing he loves. I have thought about 3 sick children and a man who came to a door at 2 in the morning because he saw a light. I think about these things and I hold them, because they are the truest things I know about the life I have. She set down her pen. Timothy came through the kitchen door, bringing the morning cold in with him, his coat dusted with the last of the spring frost that still sat on things in the early hours. He saw her at the table and met her eyes with the particular directness that had been the first thing she noticed about him, that had never changed in 5 years of being looked at by those eyes. "Coffee," she said. "Please," he said. He sat across from her and she put coffee in front of him, and they sat in the morning light at their kitchen table, the way they had been sitting at this table since the beginning of all of it, since the night he had appeared at her door and put wood on her fire and made broth and stayed. And outside the mountain was doing what it always did, which was stand, and the creek was doing what it always did, which was run, and the aspens were doing what they always did, which was reach toward the light. "Thomas wants to run the northern line himself this fall," Timothy said. "He is 14, Sadie said. "He is capable," Timothy said. "He is 14, Sadie said again. "He was 14 when he carried himself like that in the church," Timothy said. She looked at him. He was right and she knew he was right, and this was, as ever, the irritating thing about being married to a person who was right at frequent intervals. "The Northern Line only," she said, "and he comes home by dark." "Agreed," Timothy said. She looked at her coffee. She looked at the light on the table between them. She looked at him. "Timothy Barlow," she said. He looked up. "Thank you," she said, just that. She had said it in many ways over 5 years, but this was the simplest and the most complete, and she meant it for all of it, for the door at 2 in the morning, for the January cold of Harwick, for the spring that had come after the winter, for the children who were down the hall growing into themselves, for this kitchen table, for this morning, for all the mornings. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes that held everything he did not say and everything he did, and he nodded once, simply, the way she nodded when she had made a decision she was going to stand by. "Thank you," he said back, and he meant it for the same things and more, and she knew that. Outside the cabin, the Colorado Spring was making itself known in every available way, in the creek and the aspens, and the mud in the yard and the kitchen garden's first green, in the sky that was the particular blue of high country, in the light that was doing what light does in spring, which is arrive with a freshness that is almost impossible to believe unless you have come through the winter that preceded it, unless you know what the dark looked like before the light returned. They drank their coffee. The children's voices began to filter down the hall. A whole day was ahead of them, full of work and particular joys and the ordinary extraordinary fact of their life together, which was, and always would be, she knew this. She had always known this, more than she had asked for, and exactly what she needed, and entirely, gloriously, completely hers.